all the information about Babylon. I think right now we are moving to our last talk for today by our lovely host, Lili. Lili will tell us about TypeScript at Snyk. So over to you, Lili.
Thank you so much. Okay. So hi again. My name's Lili. I guess I'll tell you a little bit more about what we actually do at Snyk, so I can give you an introduction as to why we're using TypeScript and how we're using it as well. So Snyk is an open source security platform. It helps you scan your vulnerabilities, find vulnerabilities in your code base. So we mostly focus on open source packages and their vulnerabilities. So for example, if I have a repo here, which is npm project with policy, I might want to know that the dependencies that I'm using are in fact in the vulnerable range, and I might want to open a pull request and bump the version. So one of the earliest things that we did is actually a CLI. And that was written at the very, very early stages of the company. So as we were a very, very small startup when I joined, the CLI was one of the main things that was up and running and used a lot. And this was written at the time in just pure JavaScript. It was a mixture of styles, a mixture of people. It was a mixture of contractors at the time as well. You know how startups can be. But as we started experiencing hypergrowth, there were lots of features that we wanted to add, and the community was asking for them. And it became, over time, increasingly more and more obvious that it became hard for us to be able to differentiate what is, the new code that is being used all the time versus what is some dead code that feature perhaps is no longer being used. And it also became really difficult to sort of untangle what's happening where. And we really wanted to refactor this. So as we started growing, we wanted to try and refactor and make it easy to contribute to for everybody else that we were hiring. So we've turned to TypeScript as one of the tools to help us. But I don't know if anybody here has tried to do a conversion. I'd love to hear your stories if you do. And I'd also love to hear maybe what's stopping you from converting to TypeScript, because that would be interesting to talk about as well. So we decided to try TypeScript, but we didn't want to do a full-on conversion and just kind of, head down and spend all of our time just trying to convert everything and get it perfect. We needed to make sure that we could do it something small, quickly, and try to get as much benefit as we can. So let me see if I can find the original pull request where we've added TypeScript. So this would have been a few years ago now. There we go.
Hi, Lili. We are still seeing the Snyk admin panel.
Oh, really?
You wanted to show. Yeah.
Okay, let me check. I'm sharing a tab. Let me share the whole thing. Okay. So this is the Snyk CLI, Snyk. It's open source, so feel free to browse around with me as I'm talking through some things. So this is our original pull request where we've added TypeScript in 2018. So it might look like a lot of files, but I'll try and run you through some of the smaller changes that happened. So we took the opportunity to bump our node version to node 8 from 4. So that was definitely a relief. The most important thing that we want to look at is us adding a TS config. We kind of just took whatever was at the time recommended in the documentation. It just went with that. We made sure to target the right version of ES that would work for us and our customers. And we just added some basic TS lint roles. So most of the changes were in the package JSON. we needed to add a build step. And as part of that, that also meant that maybe some code needed to move to a directory to make it easy to go from source to a dist folder. So if your code isn't structured like that already, you may have a little bit of a change to make there. So there wasn't a lot of changing going on. So we updated this to have an extra build step so that we could compile everything. And the rest of the changes are actually just taking the opportunity to convert very simple things like var to const and add imports. And that's what the other 37 files are. So we did the absolute minimum, and we've made the rules as lenient as possible so that anything else that was still JavaScript, we said allow JS. And a lot of the rules were just kind of shushed away for now. And that's because there was immediate benefits anyway, even with all of that kind of muted for now, to start seeing the different sort of types errors that are coming through. So there was no actual rewriting of code, as you can see. We didn't even rename the files in most cases. So in some places where it was easy to do so, we did change it to a .ts. And that's it. So after this, we were actually ready to go. And it took a little bit of organizing. We agreed internally that essentially we would just gradually keep adding more and more value. So whenever possible, at the next time you're opening a pull request, you would again bump things from var to const. You would maybe change the imports. So those things are quite simple to do. And where possible, you would rename the file to a .ts. Then after that, we took the approach of, okay, so now that we have TypeScript in place, are there small bits of the library that we could convert to TypeScript? So for example, if I was working on a feature and it had something to do with the config, I would first commit to converting this file to TypeScript. So I would spend a little bit of time to rewrite it, to make it nice for anybody else in the future to contribute to. But as you can see, majority of the changes, again, were just updating kind of syntax to something more modern. And where possible, sometimes we added very, very basic types, just for the core areas that were also clear and easy to do so. So we didn't spend a lot of time trying to be perfect. We just wanted to start doing something. And today, this repository is still our sort of progress repository. There are some areas, unfortunately, that we didn't get a chance to fully convert, but those areas are so few and so small. So if you look in source lib, you'll see some of the top level things would have been attempted already to be migrated, but for some reason it would have prevented us from doing so. Maybe it was going to be a breaking change because of how the imports were done, or maybe it was to do with like a hot loading. So this repo really had every possible scenario you could think of, every possible type, every possible flavor of JavaScript. So some of the areas were much harder to untangle than others. And I also wanted to show a little bit of what it looks like now that we have some types in place, that we were able to start creating new things with a completely different approach. So for anything that was new, we were able to completely take advantage of types, and sort of our go-to would always be to create functions and type the inputs and outputs to them, especially if it's a library that gets consumed by everything else. And that's because if you type the core bits, TypeScript will kind of do the hard work for you. And in other places where these functions are being used, you are going to get a lot of type inference. So you don't have to type absolutely everything. You can just do the important bits to you and the ones that don't otherwise get inferred. So let's see if we have anything more interesting here. No, not particularly, but I'll show you maybe an older file so you can see the comparison. Like this code is quite far away from what the older code used to be. So if we just check anything in here, I wonder if we still have something with promise chains. So yeah, so you'll see there was, back in the day, quite a lot of promise chains going on. There would be a lot of things that were just kind of flowing but updating as they go along, and therefore mutating. And it became really difficult to understand in the end, what were you actually working with at the end of this function? Did it have all of these properties? Did it have only some? Did you delete some along the way? So TypeScript really, really helped us to try and understand what is actually happening to the data along the way. And then that gave us safety to say, okay, now that I have some types and I understand what's happening, I can start to try and untangle some of these promise chains. Luckily there's only a few. Some files would have had 7 or 8 or even more. So it's really easy to get lost, and it's really difficult to contribute, especially as we were growing a lot and we had new people joining all the time. Trying to sort of onboard onto this repository and provide value was proving difficult. So we really needed to do something different and try and make it easy for us. So that was quite a while ago. But nowadays, we would start absolutely everything with TypeScript. So we even have a template to help us get started. So we're using a chaos template because, as some people mentioned, kind of setting up the repository for the first time and adding TypeScript, even though it's really easy to go and read the documentation, it still is, a little bit of that extra effort. Have I done all of the steps right? Have I chosen the right configuration? So we've tried to make it as easy as possible with a click of a few buttons, to start a new repository. So this would be the template. So you by default get the package JSON, a TS config, you get all of the bits and pieces that you want. It's opinionated in terms of what you're going to use to format your code as well, so you don't even have to think about it. And I'll also even set up a couple of basic things for you, like this is what a test looks like, this is a TS config for a test. And this is also a nice way to try and push forward some preferred ways of working. So we wanted to migrate away from Tap because it didn't support TypeScript to Jest. And one way to do that was to create a template where only Jest would be available, so that going forward, we would only use that. So with this template, every repo that is in my team, which is tech services, gets created. And it makes it really easy for us to get started with a brand new template in one day and have something that is releasable, has a pipeline, and we can also publish to NPM really quickly. And over time, over the years, as we've experimented with using TypeScript, different people started to kind of get different ways of working with it. Just like we were talking about earlier, you have different preferences. Maybe you start by typing stuff first. Maybe you would, only add a few types. But personally, for me, I even kind of try and do pseudocode with types. It's really easy to read, and that makes it really powerful to try and decide on an interface between an API and an application, for example. By defining the set of types, you end up in a place where everybody can go away and work on different areas because the boundaries are so clear of what everybody needs to achieve. So for example, I'll show you here. So this repository is called Snyk API import. And what it does is it wraps the Snyk API and it helps users to use it as a CLI and kind of does some of the work for you. So what you might have to write for yourself, which is I want to import my repositories into Snyk. You might do this through the UI, but it's not ideal if you have, hundreds and thousands of repositories. You would like to automate this away. So instead of learning how to use the API and then, understanding how to poll for changes and knowing when the import is complete, you might just use this tool and sort of let it run with some configuration. So in order to build this, I first had to implement the API. And this is where I would start. And this is how I work today as well. Anytime I work with anything external, let's see if we can find a good one. I would start with basically typing what am I expecting to send to the API, and then typing what am I expecting to receive back from the API. So for example, here, I would create a function that, is called what the integration API does. We could quickly look at that. See if I would like to list integrations, and an integration is something that knows to speak to GitHub or GitLab or somewhere else where your projects might be. So if I want to list those, I will need to call this get endpoint, and you'll see that the response, this is the response where I'll receive the type of integration and its public ID. And do we have anything for the body? No, there's only a parameter, which is the org ID. So then we can start with saying that this is what I'm expecting to receive. I'm going to get an interface where something is going to be a string and the ID is also going to be a string. So once I've done that, that means that the minute that I start using this function anywhere, I automatically get auto-completion. I automatically know exactly what I'm going to get back. And that means that I'm less likely to make mistakes, for example, accessing a parameter that's not there. And that's really, really powerful. Let's see if we have a more complicated one. That is even less. Okay, that's more like it. Okay, so here, this is the import endpoint itself. So in order for me to import my repository, I'm going to call import. And what I'm going to get back is I'm going to get back something called location URL in the header. So what do I actually need to pass to it? So the body is here. So we get a target, files, and exclusion globs. And you'll see that I started before I even did anything. I would have created this signature first so that I understand that this will always need to return this. And I understand that I have to have this thing called the target, this thing called files, this thing called exclusion globs. And then I would need to be able to have a look at what they look like. Let's see where they're defined. There you go. So this is something called the target, and you'll see again that all I'm doing at this point is I'm basically going to go here where I'm going to see the API. I'm going to see what it expects from me. So I see that it says that I need a target that is an object with these properties. And I also need to send an array of files, and this is what a file looks like. So instead of guessing or forgetting or doing anything with this data, I would first create this type. Because then I am very, very certain that this is what I need to send. And when I create my function, I suddenly have a very clear boundary that I'm working with. It becomes really easy to sort of send the right thing and not make that mistake. And I also find that it makes me work much, much faster when integrating with APIs. Otherwise, there could be quite a lot of back and forth while you're testing, figuring out, have you sent the right shape? Are you getting back all the data that you expected? This takes all of that guesswork out of the way, and that's absolutely amazing. So yeah, I think this is what I really wanted to share, that TypeScript can be incredibly powerful when integrating with third-party APIs or even an upstream microservice, whatever it is that you have, because typing the boundary gets you most of the way to basically integrating with this tool. And that is incredible.
So thank you, Lili, a lot for this presentation. It's like super exciting for me to hear about like the migration process at like big projects, big JavaScript projects, because I was like going through the same thing at Hasura 1 year ago, like almost 1 year ago, and yeah, it's always like exciting to hear how other companies and other projects are doing it. And I have a quite a few questions for you. So let me start with the first one about unit tests. Did you have unit tests for the plain JavaScript? And if not, they are being added now?
Yes, so there were always tests, but as you know, JavaScript is incredibly flexible and forgiving. You could send all sorts of things to the test and they would still be like, yep, this is okay. So it was also a little bit difficult to trust those tests because sometimes you could see that, you know, the parameters were in the wrong order or somebody's just made a simple mistake. That doesn't happen with TypeScript. So as part of the migration, we committed to also migrating the tests. There's no point having, you know, TypeScript in your code, but then the tests being very lenient. So we wanted to also make sure that the tests were just as strict, and it also forces you to mock things that are realistic shape so that you're not missing some important bits that you would never get in real life. Like if you have an object with some properties that are mandatory and it was impossible to have a partial version of it, in the test you also shouldn't have a partial version because then you're not testing on real data.
And would you say that it's now easier to test the code base to write those tests with TypeScript?
Absolutely. Again, auto completion is amazing. You suddenly get like, this is what you should send to me. And you go, okay, I'm just going to create a fixture that is exactly that shape because otherwise it's not going to compile. So it may sound like a little bit more work, but in the end, having tests that catch things before you've even pushed the code is, a lot more powerful than having to find this random bug later.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. You've been showing this template, this TypeScript template, and we have a question. Is it private or is it public?
It is a public template. I think everything in that in my group is basically public. So we mostly build open source tools for our customers. So we want them to be able to see the code because as a security company, you also want to say, hey, this is what we do with the things that you're giving us. But also it means that they can add some extra use cases that maybe we wouldn't support, like a package that's no longer supported or a framework that is no longer even alive.
Okay, got you. And could you tell us a bit about like what's the balance between new code versus maintenance or cleanup at Snyk?
New code versus maintenance. I mean, it's an ongoing battle always, especially as you're growing. But what we really try and do, and what is personally really important to me, is that every time you're adding a new feature or you're fixing a bug, if there's something in the area that you're working in that's not right, that's outdated, tidy it up first, make it nicer than when you found it. So that way you're constantly pushing forward. And this is how we've progressed with our migration, and we're able to complete the migration for our main application, which is private, to 100% TypeScript, even though it was absolutely huge. But it just means by making it part of your process, not only are you constantly improving your code base, but also you're teaching yourself like good house cleaning tips. It's like, once you've had dinner, you're going to wash up your plates. Why not do that in your code base?
Yeah, I totally get it. We've been doing the same at Hasura. Like, whenever there's a new pull request, we try to convert every file that we touch, and sometimes something else, depending like whether we have more time or not. So definitely
Exactly,
makes
right?
sense.
It's the time.
Yeah.
So like, are you
Yeah.
really pressed for time? Maybe you have to cut a corner a little bit and say, I'm not going to convert as much as I wanted to. And if you have a bit more time, you're going to say, I've done all of this. Please, please review.
Yes, exactly. So I have a few questions myself for you. So Snyk is an open source project, and was community helping out with the migration?
Not with the migration, no. So as it's a CLI for being able to communicate with the platform directly, most of the open source contributions are from customers that have a unique setup or have a setup that is not yet supported, but they really want to see it working because maybe they use it on a different project. So we've had some amazing, meaningful contributions from people that are experts in Java, for example, because they would see something and say, this doesn't quite work for my project, but by the way, here's here's how it could work. And so we would work with them to try and get those changes in.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And how was it with learning TypeScript? So did you, when you made this decision to go with TypeScript, did the team already know TypeScript? Were you familiar, all of you in the team with TypeScript, or did you need to learn it
That's a
from
really good
scratch?
question. And thinking about it now, it seems insane. But no, we didn't know TypeScript, right? But what we did know is that it was just JavaScript. So we knew that even though we didn't know TypeScript, we didn't have to in order for things to keep working. We could keep writing JavaScript while we learned TypeScript. So that's what we did. We made sure that everybody knew that there was space and time for that learning and encourage people to say, hey, you could convert this file to TypeScript in less than 5 minutes. Let me pair with you. I'll show you how to do this if you're not familiar. So it wasn't, we just knew that we needed something like TypeScript to help us with the problems that we were seeing, small bugs, things not like the parameters being in the wrong shape and nothing catching it. Like those kind of things, once you've experienced them, you look for something to try and get rid of it. And TypeScript promised to help.
Yeah, I get it. Cool, thank you. So my last question, I promise this is my last question. Did you also consider other languages, or was it only TypeScript? We're going with TypeScript. Did you consider Reason or Elm or PureScript or all of that, or Flow maybe?
We did consider Flow, but we went with TypeScript, and I don't remember why. We did have a couple of days where it was a spike as a proof of concept, and TypeScript just worked for us at that time. So we basically decided that because of the spike that we could do the migration in less than a couple of days, and therefore that was powerful for us, and we just went with it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I see that we don't have any other questions. So maybe you would like to add something, Lili?
So yeah, thank
Or
you.
any questions?
Thank you so much for having me today. This was really, really great, especially having the ability to talk about TypeScript with, especially with people that are working on exciting things. It's quite rare, so this was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm really also very excited to be a host for today's meetup. And I think we are going to wrap up today's event.